First impressions are a key ingredient to a game's palatability and general success. The first hour has to hook the player in some way to keep them interested. The games on this list still take that advice to heart, but often do so in more unorthodox ways. Some games start off slow and steady, setting the stage for what's about to be a grand epic, while other intros act as a prologue set long before the events of the game proper. Here are 10 such titles that change completely after the first hour. Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Metal Gear Solid 2's first mission aboard the tanker firmly establishes Solid Snake as the ongoing hero of the series, coaxing players into a sense of familiarity. But an hour into the game, things change. There's a fast forward of 2 years and Snake is presumed dead. The rest of the game is played through the lens of Raiden, a new recruit who, though lacks the expertise and wit of Snake, demonstrates greater agility and a good amount of skill. The biggest gameplay difference between Raiden and Snake is the quick roll between cover that can be pulled off when controlling Raiden.
Raiden.
Raiden? Strange code name.
Makes up for the boring one my parents gave me.
Maybe I'll find out someday.
Besides his agility in combat, he lacks the charismatic banter and iconic gravelly voice of Snake, resulting in many frustrated and disappointed players at the time of MGS2's release. Imagine your favorite character getting sidelined for an entire game with little confidence in his return. In hindsight, we appreciate Raiden for his future and badass appearances in MGS Rising Revengeance, but in 2001, there was no surefire guarantee Solid Snake would take the spotlight again. Prey 2017. Prey's opening is a masterclass on how to build intrigue while completely immersing the player in the game world. Arcane's Prey builds off of 2006's Prey with a similar slice-of-life intro that gets upended and warped into a sci-fi nightmare, though the two titles aren't connected. Morgan wakes up to get ready for work in a high-rise apartment in what looks like a futuristic San Francisco. The game's physics engine allows any object to be picked up and thrown, and there's a slew of emails and notes to read about the apartment, providing some context and lore. Players can't be blamed for spending some time admiring the high-rise views and exploring the interactive elements. After a nice helicopter ride to Morgan's job site, a horrific Typhon creature attacks one of the scientists and Morgan blacks out. What comes next flips the status quo completely on its head. Morgan wakes up more or less like nothing ever happened, to an alarm in the same apartment building as before, but things aren't quite right. After some exploration, it's revealed that the entire building is just a simulation aboard a space station. Nothing was as it seemed, and the remainder of the game is spent trying to survive on board the isolated and dangerous Talos 1 station. The Last of Us Part 1. The core of The Last of Us's gameplay doesn't emerge until an hour or so into the game, and it's not due to clumsy tutorials wasting the player's time. No, the first hour is spent setting up the world state that would characterize the award-winning series. You don't start the game busting zombies' heads open as a hardened badass, but instead wake up in the shoes of Joel's daughter, Sarah. The game lets you explore Joel's house, which contains a fair amount of mementos and bits of backstory into who these characters were before the zombie outbreak. An evacuation and car crash later, and we're playing as Joel, carrying Sarah in a desperate attempt to outrun the infected hordes. After one of the more tragic scenes in gaming, there's a pretty substantial time skip as we finally control the hardened Joel that encapsulates the rest of the game. It's the perfect intro to a zombie game, and it didn't even need to give the player a weapon to feel the tension and anxiety of that setting. Red Dead Redemption 2. Rockstar Games typically lets players loose in their game world pretty early on. That's not at all the case with Red Dead Redemption 2. It takes around an hour or so for the on-rails story missions to ease up. Players who just want to live out their Wild West fantasies in an immersive open world have to wait it out and experience the story setup first. Of course, that isn't to say that the opening hours aren't action-packed or interesting in their own right. The game introduces the over-the-shoulder shooting mechanics and melee combat with some battles against a rival gang. But it's true that the majority of the game's opening hours involve slowly riding horseback alongside some snowy mountains, listening to character banter. Red Dead Redemption 2 has even more open-world freedom than the first game, but it takes a bit longer to reach that point this time around.
You asked for it.
We ain't
5,
opening this door.
4, 3, 2, 1. Seems our friends have gone deaf. Wake them up a little.
The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. And speaking of slow burns, there's perhaps no better example than 2006's The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. The game starts out with a Harvest Moon-esque sequence of Link talking to villagers and doing a series of chores on the farm. Ordon is a peaceful village, and all is idyllic during these moments. Not sure, you get a slingshot tutorial, but there's pretty much no need for combat when things are this peaceful. Obviously, Link gets thrust onto the hero's journey eventually, but it takes a good bit of time to reach. Twilight Princess is one of the darkest games in the series, featuring some horror elements with the villain, Zant, and the eerie ghost within the Twilight realm. It's also one of the more fast-paced and action-packed games in the series, but the idyllic opener wouldn't give that impression. The greatness of Twilight Princess's opening is just how effective it sets the stakes at play. It establishes that a peaceful and idyllic village like Ordon can be erased at the hands of evil. In a way, Ordon fulfills a similar role as the Shire from The Lord of the Rings. Death Stranding. While Death Stranding's opening does a good job giving players a taste of what the game is all about, nothing can prepare players for the craziness that occurs in the middle and the end of the game. The game begins like a vague dream, with tons of bizarre terms and lore that still makes our heads spin today. The exposition-heavy prologue features roughly 40 minutes of cinematics and 20 minutes of gameplay. The precious few moments that you are given some control, you're tasked with picking up and dropping cargo and transporting it through some mountainous terrain in a rain before getting sidelined by threats of some BDs. It's a nice tutorial of what you'll be doing in the core game, but with none of the open-ended freedom. It would be another hour or so until the game's core features really open up. Much of Death Stranding's charm is in its bizarrely beautiful open world, touting varied terrain to overcome and breathtaking vistas to admire. Players don't truly get to experience the core Strand-like gameplay until the ability to build infrastructure such as bridges and walkways for other real-life players becomes available later. And while there's still plenty of protracted cinematics throughout the rest of the game, there's usually large swaths of open-ended delivery gameplay to offset it, unlike the exposition-heavy opening. Kingdom Hearts 2. Kingdom Hearts 2 really threw fans for a loop with its opening focus on Roxas rather than Sora. What's more, the location of this game's intro wasn't explored in past games, making the whole sequence feel like some Twilight Zone episode. Roxas's summer vacation with his friends in Twilight Town functioned more or less as a gameplay tutorial as well, though the magic system and gummy ship stuff really doesn't come into play until Sora finally enters the picture. Millions of players ask the same questions during Kingdom Hearts 2's opening hours. Where is Sora, Donald, and Goofy, and who the heck is Roxas? Part of the brilliance of Kingdom Hearts 2 is how those questions get explored throughout the course of this game. The Stanley Parable. There's not many games that sell based on intrigue alone, but the Stanley Parable is one of them. It's very much an experiment on what it means to be a game. As soon as players boot up from the start menu, a charming narrator describes a typical day at the office for Stanley. This is where player agency comes into question. Should I continue following the narrator's cues, or do I completely avert expectations? And so one of thousands of different routes begins. The first hour of the Stanley Parable is much different from the rest of the game because of how branching the choices are, not to mention how much more of the narrator's own personality gets exposed the more the player disobeys. Control. Control is another game on this list that subverts expectations with its bizarre setting and story. The entire game takes place within a fluidly changing skyscraper called the Oldest House. The interior of this building is a labyrinth, boasting an ever-shifting space that is much larger than its exterior would suggest. The first hour of the game is strange enough, with the introduction of the Oldest House and some of the abilities you'll engage with. But the game doesn't reveal its true structure until later on after you gain more supernatural abilities and unravel more of this truly bizarre story. Firewatch. Firewatch is one of the more fascinating narrative games that I've played. It follows the daily life of a fire lookout worker over the course of a month. You'd think this would get boring, but it only gets more interesting as the days progress. This is because Firewatch is a slowly unraveling mystery with little breadcrumbs hinting that something isn't quite right. From a gameplay perspective, things don't really progress too much past the first hour. You're walking around and doing basic tasks like using a flashlight and walkie-talkie to communicate with your distant partner Delilah from the beginning to the end. But where the game ends is such a change from where it began that it does warrant a place on this list. And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at Gaming Vault, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.